So in Module 5, what we're going to explore is the specific types of neurocognitive disorder. And we're specifically going to look at 3 different types in this module. And then in Module 6, we'll go through a few more types of neurocognitive disorders. So what we're going to start with is the one that probably most of you have heard of before, and then get into ones that are a little less well known. And this more common one is Alzheimer's disease. Now, we know with Alzheimer's disease that the onset is gradual and cognitive deterioration is going to be progressive, meaning that it continually slowly erodes on a slow and steady kind of fashion. The speed of onset serves as a main distinguishing feature from other types of dementia. The only way, though, that we can really diagnose Alzheimer's is through an autopsy after the person has died, though they are getting better with some of their scans to know if somebody has Alzheimer's specifically. And then, of course, we have some of the patterns of symptoms over time. Now, what makes Alzheimer's unique? One of the things is the presence of what we call neurofibrillary tangles. So you can see on the down right illustration here on the slide, you have your normal brain and neurons, and then you have what we call neurofibrillary tangles and amyloid plaques. Now, the neurofibrillary tangles, what we tend to see is that those are located in the cerebral cortex and the hippocampus. And of course, the hippocampus is one of the areas that helps with the consolidation of our memories. And tau proteins are proteins that are associated with the assembly and stability of microtubules for neurons, kind of like a lattice or structure that get broken off, and then they form these disorganized kind of tangles. And we see that very evident in autopsies of those that we suspect with Alzheimer's. The other thing that I mentioned in that particular picture there is amyloid plaques, and that is more found in the cerebral cortex. And it consists of central cores of homogeneous protein materials called beta amyloid, and they're surrounded by clumps of debris left over from destroyed neurons. So a lot of the treatments and cures that have been a focus have been trying to reduce the level of amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. Unfortunately, we also see some of those same sorts of things in individuals who do not have Alzheimer's disease and that are actually fairly well functioning. So we still don't know all that we should with Alzheimer's, but there is a lot of research going on at this point in time. Now, here are 10 warning signs of Alzheimer's disease that are on the Alzheimer's Awareness website. And you can see some of these we've already kind of talked about, but memory loss that's going to disrupt daily life, having a challenge in planning or solving problems, difficulty even completing familiar tasks, confusion as to the time and place, so that gets into that mini mental status exam, trouble understanding visual images and spatial relationships, or maybe having new problems with words and speaking and writing. That gets into some of the agnosia that we talked about. Misplacing things or losing the ability to retrace their steps, that goes into those memory components. The decreased or poor judgment, so poor social judgment, maybe withdrawing from work or social activities, and change in mood or personality. So all of these are signs that Alzheimer's may be at play. Obviously, you don't have to have all of these, just like you don't for other disorders, but these could be a good starting point if you suspect that somebody might have this. As far as the brain, on the top there, you can see the brain degradation. We saw that on a prior slide. So there on the left is a typical functioning brain, and there on the right, you begin to see one that's been affected by Alzheimer's. So you can see extreme shrinkage of the cerebral cortex, severity of enlarged ventricles. So those are the open parts of the brain where the cerebrospinal fluid flows, and extreme shrinkage in the hippocampal area. Now down below, you got to flip it. So on the right-hand side is your typical functioning brain, and you look at how it's lit up. And on the left-hand side, this is a PET scan. So a PET scan is measuring ongoing kind of blood flow to the brain, with the idea that the more the blood flow is going to a particular part of the brain, the harder it's working, thereby indicating that that part of it's being used. And as you can see with Alzheimer's, you just don't see it light up in the same way, the one on the left as opposed to the one on the right. As far as progression, mild cognitive impairment, you can see that upwards of 7 years. Short-term memory loss, but still being able to function fairly effectively. Mild Alzheimer's, you're seeing that for a couple years, where now the disease has spread and you're beginning to see it more in the lateral, temporal, and parietal lobes. So you can see that in the darkened areas there. And now the symptoms include things like reading problems, poor object recognition, so the aphasia that we were talking about, the agnosia we were talking about, and then poor direction sense, so not really aware of where they are. Moderate, you can see, is another duration of a couple years, and now that's starting to spread to the frontal lobe. And so we would see impulsivity and short attention because the frontal lobe helps control that. And then finally, the severe Alzheimer's, which occurs over a 3-year period. And it's now starts to impede the occipital lobe, which is where we process all our vision. So what we're going to go into next here is the diagnosis of a different disorder, not Alzheimer's, but it does resemble it in many ways. So this is what we call frontotemporal neurocognitive disorder. Doesn't exactly roll across the tongue there. It is a rare form. So whereas Alzheimer's is quite common, we don't see this frontotemporal neurocognitive disorder very often. And what you have happen here is a circumscribed atrophy of the frontal and temporal lobes. So whereas in Alzheimer's, you don't see the frontal lobes being impacted until well into the disorder, you see that as a hallmark of the frontotemporal kind of dementia. The early personality changes are going to precede any cognitive impairment, which is a little different than you see in Alzheimer's. You're also going to see much more impulsive actions because of that heavy frontal lobe focus of the degradation. So you might see impulsive sexual actions, more roaming, being a little bit more aimless, as opposed to with Alzheimer's. You might also see some sorts of other disinhibited kind of behaviors. So you're not going to probably see frontotemporal neurocognitive disorder nearly at the frequency level that you do with Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is the most common form of dementia or neurocognitive disorder. And the second most common is something called neurocognitive disorder with Lewy bodies. This is something that has just really recently started venturing into textbooks. And so what you see here, and I've got a couple photos, the one on the right is an illustration which shows the Lewy body. And the Lewy body is just a rounded deposit that is found in the nerve cell. Obviously, it impedes its effectiveness in being able to put out signals. And it has roughly about 20% of all dementia cases fall into this neurocognitive with Lewy bodies. The initial symptoms that we see here are memory deficits that are followed by more global major neurocognitive disorder traits. And you're also going to see cognitive impairment. And cognitive impairment in this role is going to be problems with attention, executive function, problem solving, visual spatial kind of performance. They show kind of fluctuating cognitive performance, alertness, and levels of consciousness in regards to this. So this is kind of an ebb and flow. There may be presence of recurrent and detailed visual hallucinations, and yet they're going to recognize that these hallucinations are not real, which is maybe how it would be different from a, say, schizophrenia type of diagnosis. So that's the end of Module 5, and Module 6 will continue talking about a few more specific types of neurocognitive disorder.